Hi, everybody. Good morning. I am Seema Kumar. I am the CEO of Cure, and I want to welcome you to Tuesday Talks. So typically, we do our Tuesday Talks in the evening here, right here. Every Tuesday, there is a discussion of something of importance to the healthcare community, to the scientific community. But every so often, like today, where we have the UN Science Summit happening here and taking place here, we occasionally do it during the day. And we're always live on LinkedIn when we do this, so it's a hybrid, in-person and live. And so I want to say welcome to everybody. Tuesday Talks focuses on things that are top of mind for people. And we have our whole ecosystem here in New York City and beyond and globally engaged in this. And so welcome. And today we're going to have a conversation about science and inclusivity and collaboration and cooperation. And we'll dive right into it. And so with that, let me first introduce our panelists today. And they're all here for the UN Science Summit and on the heels of the UN General Assembly meeting here in New York City. So New York City is bustling, and we're hoping to kick off this conversation. So to my left is Bernardo Mariano, Jr. He is the Chief Information Technology Officer at United Nations. Welcome, Bernardo.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
Good to be here.
And then we have Magdalena Skipper. She's Editor-in-Chief of Nature Springer. Hi, Magdalena, welcome.
Hi, very good to be here.
And Alejandro Adam, who is the President of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you all here. So, as I mentioned, here we are in the city. We are, here to recognize and be part of the United Nations General Assembly meeting, but also talk about science and collaboration and cooperation. So, as you think about this, and Magdalena, as you mentioned, there were a lot of us who were talking about these very same topics, mostly on Zoom the last couple of years because of the pandemic. But here we are in person. And dare we say in the post-pandemic era, although, we still hear that the COVID cases are surging, but what is on top of your mind as you think about science, inclusivity, United Nations, and things, new science that's coming into the world and the old science that continues to be here and the access issues. So I'm going to kick it off with you, Bernardo. What's top of mind for you? I mean, what's keeping you up at night and what is giving you optimism and hope?
Thank you for having me here to start with. I think as we go through this industrial revolution or the new the revolution of AI, that generative AI, artificial intelligence is bringing, I think what keeps me at night is how are we shaping the world through technology by repeating the mistakes from the past? And how can we avoid those mistakes of divide, of those who can, those who cannot, those who have or those who don't have, and those who are wealthier, those who are not, those who feed the data or those who make profit out of the data. So how to make sure that in the digital ecosystem that we are currently building and the whole transformation in that ecosystem to ensure that equality, to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind, to make sure really that we are true in our goal to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal in that digital ecosystem. And I'll give you an example. Mm-hmm. Because I used to be a CIO for the World Health Organization before becoming, as well as Director of Digital Health at the World Health Organization before becoming the Chief Information Technology Officer at United Nations. Let's think about gaming disorder as a new disease. Mm-hmm. And as a disease that happens in the digital ecosystem. It's a disease where the gamer is actually having a mental health issues in that ecosystem. Yeah. And the role of United Nations, or all the multilateral organizations, international organizations, non-profit, as well as the caregivers, is still happening in the physical ecosystem. and we are completely absent in that digital ecosystem. So that's where, when I say repeating the mistakes from the past, we have to really rethink how we support, making sure that how we bring the value where it's needed in that ecosystem where we have the young people extracting benefits, but also being impacted by the risks associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because we've continued to have the haves and the have-nots of the world, and those who have access and privilege and those who don't. And but what you're saying is that as we build this new digital ecosystem, we have the ability to shape it so that we don't make the mistakes of the past. And how do we do that and not repeat the same thing? We have the ability to shape a new future. Magdalena, what about you? What keeps you up at night? What's top of mind for you?
So let me start with top of mind. I'm a kind of person whose glass is always half full, so I like to start with the positive, and then I'll move on to the things that keep me up at night. So top of my mind right now is the opportunity that is before us, not least because we are here at the Science Summit, as you said, really feeding into the UN General Assembly. It's so clear that science is really center at the heart of Sustainable Development Goals, is really the only path through which those goals and anything that comes after them can be achieved. And very crucial, earlier today we were already discussing how, although there are 17 goals, each of which has a subset of targets, they are, of course, not they were not created in isolation. There is so much interchange and sort of dovetailing between them. And that allows us to focus on something which is so fundamental in science as well, and that's collaboration across disciplines, but also across sectors. In your introduction, you mentioned the pandemic. And of course, that is almost a cliche by now, but nevertheless, I'm going to repeat it as a reminder, as an example of how important the collaboration between the technology developers, virologists, medical researchers was, but also crucially, how important it was to bring in social scientists, behavioral scientists. As often I say, you can have the most efficacious vaccine. If people are not going to take it, it's not going to achieve its potential. And of course, another crucial aspect that was brought out by the vaccine development in the context of COVID was that collaboration between academia and industry. It was referred to earlier again. It has been a fantastic success over the years. When I was starting out in my research career, there wasn't much conversation between the academic researchers and researchers in the private sector. Now, in the biopharma, biomedical space, that's an ongoing conversation. And actually, it's a wonderful example for other disciplines, for other sectors, to take up. One of those sectors, for example, where I haven't seen so much action yet, as it were, but I think there is a lot of hope, it's in the context of food systems transformation. I think that collaboration, that dialogue, that conversation between the private and public sector in that space is very much needed and very timely. And of course, all of this, I mentioned all these different collaborations across disciplines, across sectors. Increasingly, we recognize collectively that those collaborations have to be inclusive across the globe, but also inclusive of those who don't have a formal research training. And that actually very interestingly reflects in my daily role in the context of my work as an editor of a scientific journal. Today, we increasingly think how those individuals who are not formally trained in research or medicine for that matter, how they can contribute. Can they be authors on a paper? Can they be part of co-creation? I mean, it's actually today quite common that patients co-create, for example, co-design clinical trials.
Yeah,
exactly. Could in some instances those individuals be reviewers of papers? Of course not of the technical aspects, but of other contexts. So there are some really interesting opportunities, as I say, for all of us to consider here. Now, very briefly now, what keeps me up at night, very unfortunately, what keeps me up at night is the potential for misinformation, lack of appropriate understanding of what the role of science is, what science and scientists are trying to achieve. So that lack of appreciation of the potential and misuse of some of the research outcomes is a real concern, not for scientists alone, but for all of us, actually. I think we've already talked, of course, about the fact that science touches on all different aspects. And one of the speakers earlier today talked about how science ought to be part of all aspects of policy. I firmly believe that. It should be part of all walks of life, really. So in this context, safeguarding against misinformation is absolutely pivotal.
Yeah, it's interesting because, even during the pandemic, and not to keep bringing up the pandemic, but we saw a sort of a tale of two cities. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times for science, because on the one hand, science was in the headlines with all of the vaccines and the progress that was taking place, and then all of a sudden, it was down in the dumps again in terms of public perception. So we're going to come back to the issue of trust. What about you? What do you think, Alejandro?
Well, I'm a president of a research funding agency, and I'm also happen to be chair of the Global Research Council, which is a virtual organization that has about 100 research funding agencies around the world. And well, we see sort of things going in different directions. On the one hand, we're funding all the great scientists, all the great students in the different countries around the world. And then we see that science is not always given the kind of support that you'd expect, given the talent and the implications of the work that has been done. In particular, you mentioned the pandemic, but it goes across many different areas. Fantastic work is being done. So my biggest concern in the day-to-day work that we have to do is justify the funding levels. How do we get the resources to the researchers, to the students, specifically to the next generation, to the postdocs, the early career researchers, so that they can continue doing the fantastic work that we want them to do, that we know that they can do. So there are a number of issues that we've addressed in the Global Research Council that we talk about, and that, what's important here is framing the value of science to society, so then you can make an argument to your government and to the governments of the world.
Yeah.
But of course, we have different countries have different agencies. So there's going to be regional, national priorities, then continental priorities, and how do you get them into global priorities? So that's what I like about the Sustainable Development Goals, that it gives us an overarching framework that you can explain to almost any politician if you want, because in the end, those are the ultimate deciders.
Yeah.
But there are a number of axes there that we have to keep track of, and they've been mentioned here. But of course, the access, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We live in a world where everyone should be able to benefit from science. Sustainability. Science as an integral part of sustainability. For us, it's kind of obvious, but do not take anything for granted when you're talking to folks in the political class, governments that come and go. You have to constantly reiterate the fact that science underlies all those sustainable development goals. And perhaps the trickiest is how do you create and fund multilateral collaborations that can address these big challenges. Because it's not so hard to state them and everyone to agree that they're important, but how do you get every country to contribute what they should to address them? And now the other interesting situation that we see is the dichotomy between basic science, right, where you have curiosity-driven science, and the more mission-oriented science. And we, I think, can accept that they have to coexist.
Yeah.
Because new ideas are being developed all the time, driven by curiosity, but then they're mobilized into great ideas, into great applications that can find solutions. And the other important point, of course, is to engage the private sector. How do you find good ways, because governments cannot fund everything. How do you get the private sector, and our colleague here has given some fantastic examples, how do you do it as a standard procedure for mobilizing these great solutions? So those are some of the things that we're pondering day and night.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. There's so many different threads to pull on in what you said. But let's focus for a minute on the trust and the fact that science underlies all of the global goals, right? Sustainable development goals. So I want to ask you, Bernardo, do you think people understand that? And do you think science itself is accessible to all? Appreciation for science, knowledge of science, literacy in science. And if you don't have that, how do you achieve the rest of it?
I think we have to accept that there are different level of development and evolution and acceptance in the world. When I think of my mother who sits in Mozambique in the northern part of the country, I'm from Mozambique, by the way, so how that science is impacting her is different than somebody sitting here in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And then with that understanding, we have to then, picking of what Magdalena said, even as we collaborate, we have to make sure that there's a direct, a meaningful impact, a positive impact to my mother who's sitting in the north of Mozambique.
Yes.
Not just to me and my friends and the people sitting in New York or in the Northern Hemisphere. So then how do you bring trust of science to those who perhaps are very far away from where the evolution or the development or the innovation started? But also, how do you bring the innovation that starts right there to in an ecosystem like this one? Because the fact that my mother is sitting in the north of Mozambique doesn't mean that there's no innovation happening. Absolutely. Right there to benefit that community. Yep. So currently, we have this element of trust that has to, that only the trust is inherited from an ecosystem that is designed here, but then we do not really leverage or promote the trust, the trust of something that starts back in Mozambique, in the northern part of Mozambique, right? So how do you bring this inclusivity and collaboration? And yes, I'm still picking on Magdalena's point of collaboration. The collaboration is not just about the like-minded, it's also about the different mindsets, those who have a number of traditions that perhaps are not fully backed up by science, and how do you bring that? Because after all, if you take the COVID-19, the vaccine itself, so you want these benefits to be felt all across. So the different dimensions on technology, politics, economics, social and culture, trust and ethics, as well as a regulatory environment, and as well as the environmental impact. Those are all dimensions that we need to make sure that we keep in mind as we evolve and develop science, be it a science that started from the south, or be it a science that started in the north.
That's a great point. That is inclusivity in terms of not just the fruits of science and the impact of science, but also science, the generation of science and the generation of knowledge. It can take various forms, but it needs to be collaboration across the board. Magdalena, you spoke about collaboration, right? Where do you think we are when it comes to international scientific collaboration? You also said that you like to see the half glass full, but can you talk about, is it half full, quarter full, or 3/4 full? And how do we fill up the rest of the emptiness?
I like this. The boundaries of my optimism are being pushed.
Tested.
That's right. Exactly. Well, I'm going to refrain from directly addressing what's the percentage of the glass that is full, although I think it sort of varies. We can take that analogy as far as we want. But I think it's important to consider the positives and the limitations. And thank you, Bernardo, for building on what I said about collaborations, because of course that inclusivity to collaborations is absolutely crucial. And I would suggest that it's as crucial to your mum in northern Mozambique and others like her as it is to those who are actually doing the science, because they have an awful lot to learn from your mum, her community, and other communities like this. To come back to the trust point, of course, we all know that trust is not a given, it has to be earned. And I think science has gone through a phase, and I deliberately use sort of a past tense to describe it, has gone through a phase when it was apart from society. It was considered to be too technical, too difficult to explain, and you needed experts to advance it. And we used this wonderfly descriptive, on many levels, term, ivory tower. Mm-hmm. I think we will all agree that that term is used extremely rarely today, because we've all realized, and all, I really mean all, the whole of science ecosystem, that not only is it inappropriate and unjust, it also doesn't make for good science. So by being open to collaboration in that very open, global, across sectors of society ways, we're actually moving towards better science that is more relevant. I'm actually going to refer to your comment, Alejandro, about this. You called dichotomy between basic or fundamental science and mission-driven science. It was a wonderful term that is increasingly used. Well, can we remove that dichotomy? Can we blend it? Because actually there are elements of fundamental science in mission-driven science. And that in itself, what I would like to weave in here is that consideration. We should reconsider what type of science we value more or less. What I would like to suggest that we value all types of science equally. So very applied, implementation research that is relevant to some solution on the ground should be as valued and rewarded and recognized as some fundamental science discovery. We're not there today, not quite. But I think raising that appreciation, that some conceptual insight is, of course, incredibly important. But so is, for example, doing research that is going to directly influence governmental policies that support small-scale farmers, for example. That they're both equally valuable.
Equally valuable. That's interesting, and we'll come back to sort of the value placed on basic versus mission-driven, and why isn't there a Nobel Prize yet for mission-driven science? We'll come back to that a little bit later. But you chair, you said, the Global Science Council, right? From your vantage point, what do you see in terms of inclusivity and collaboration across the globe?
Well, we have meetings, regional meetings, and then global meetings, where we have these tables where there's very frank discussions about issues like equity, diversity, and inclusion, gender inequities. And we see meetings of the mind and learning best practices from around the globe. Because, as our colleagues here mentioned, it's a world where no one is doing things, no one has the best solution, no one has a silver bullet. We'll have to work together and come up with what we can see as the best possible approximation, right? So these best practices, those tables, I find, are very, very fruitful. And you bring people, say, from New Zealand, Brazil, South Africa, coming together with folks from Europe, et cetera, and you come up with very, very fruitful, very constructive guidelines for how research funding agencies should function. A particular theme is that of the evaluation of research proposals. There's been a fundamental shift away from bibliometrics notes and just the usual stacking of papers, to trying to measure impact in a more meaningful way. This, of course, requires a culture change in the scientific community, because in the end, the decisions on grants are made by the scientists, right? And we're very respectful of the peer review process. So with that, I've seen some tremendous progress over the past 5 years or so, and I think that's starting to accelerate. And with the newer generations that will learn these new methodologies for evaluating what is great science, what is science that is useful, I think we will get to a different place. Now, that doesn't mean that a Nature paper isn't great to have, right? But it's not the only metric on which to judge somebody, right? Yep. And I think it's very important that be said. And interweaving the basic science with its mobilization and the mission-oriented science is absolutely the direction that we want to go to, where we're respectful of all the different steps in that process.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a brief comment to extend on what you're building. I absolutely agree. So what is a Nature paper has evolved significantly over the years. I've been in my role for 5 years as editor-in-chief of Nature. The journal is 154 years old. And when we were celebrating our 150th anniversary, I was joking that for the vast majority of our history, we were a multidisciplinary journal in the natural sciences, because we were only looking for basic fundamental research advances. That is most emphatically not the case, by which I mean we are, of course, still very interested in fundamental research advances, but we are now very interested in these other types of research that provide impact on a different level, very real-life impact. Nevertheless, there remains a challenge. How do you evaluate that impact? Because we know that the traditional measure in citations is, of course, the academic measure of impact, which we are all now agreeing we're moving beyond. So, this is something that at Nature we have written for many, many years, that researchers ought to be evaluated, appreciated for a number of different contributions, including different types of research they engage in. It's not an easy challenge to solve, but at least we all, funders, editors, publishers, researchers, are beginning to talk about it loud and clear. And there are some interesting new ways of changing our perspective and changing what we value. Not a moment too soon.
Yes. You had to comment because you said Nature. Of course,
cool.
right? Yes. So I have two more questions, but I also want to make sure that the audience knows that we'll take questions from the audience. And those of you on LinkedIn Live, we are taking questions also online from LinkedIn. So please send in your questions ASAP. So I'm going to ask one question, and I have to choose one because I have two important questions, but I'll choose one. Only because we want to give audience a chance and get some engagement from LinkedIn. So I was going to go to trust in science, but that's a topic I think we can have a whole day conference on trust in science, so I won't go there. Let me talk about AI. There is, that's like the new buzz, and it reminds me back to the days of the Human Genome Project, where on the one hand, there was the wow factor about the potential to have the human blueprint on your computer, laptop, and to be able to do all kinds of wonderful progress in the scientific arena. But then there were the ethical, legal, social implications. Similarly, of course, with AI, the promise is there. It's all the buzz now. But how do we ensure that the power of AI can be leveraged for good in a responsible way? And I'm going to ask you all to share your thoughts. And in the meantime, think of questions. And those of you on LinkedIn as well, think of questions.
If I may start,
yeah.
I think we all need to remember one thing about technology. There is always a hype cycle, meaning that there is a moment, a period of overpromise, and the delivery is not as much as what is promised. Everyone, if you think, you remember the Y2K, and I can name a few others. So there is a hype cycle. So we are on this hype cycle of AI where there's a lot of promise. But on the other hand, there are real issues and the real benefits and the real issues. So from the United Nations perspective, we want to make sure that AI is used ethically, is human rights based, and internally already providing, using it internally through making sure that we address all the risks, but also we are supporting some countries. Now, from the governance perspective, because if you think about the collaboration dialogue, you have the academia, the private sector, civil society, public sector, both international and national. So AI started in the private sector, so everybody else is catching up. Yeah. So regulatory framework is needed. So the Secretary General of the United Nations has, I think that just end of August, the call for applications ended to create a high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence, to really start discussing what type of global governance is needed. Because we don't want to see weaponized AI, weaponized tools being used in making decisions on the fly. To really, will really, the analogy, only analogy I can give is like the atomic bomb, because atomic energy can be used for good, but also can be used with a devastating effect. Yep. So that regulatory framework is needed. So from the United Nations, that's what we're doing. We also released recently the ethics of AI, released by UNESCO. That those are guiding principles. So all to say that in this framework, where I go back to what I said in the beginning, those who have, those who don't have, we want to make sure that even those who don't have, as they embrace this new technology, they embrace in a way that it really, we really extract the best part of it. So AI for good, AI to accelerate SDGs, and AI to make sure that the risk elements are not do not exacerbate the divide and the undevelopment or create new wars. So all to say that I think this is a moment, a transformational moment that AI is giving us an opportunity to really use it, accelerate it, but we have to make sure that we humans remains in charge.
Very human-centric and, human-driven, right? Magdalena?
So I'll start with what Bernardo left off with. Absolutely, I see AI as a technology for humans to continue to develop, refine, and use, rather than being taken over by or in any other combination. There has, of course, been tremendous degree of excitement about the potential of AI in the context of research itself. As a tool in drug design, small molecule screening, material science, and et cetera, et cetera. And that I see very much as progressing, moving forward as one of the tools, one of the more sophisticated tools. And I see as a great potential in being incorporated into research practice. From an editorial perspective, in terms of communicating research either to the research community or to the society at large, I think it's important that we don't hand over that communication to AI. So, right at the very beginning, we made editorial statements saying that manuscripts cannot be written by AI tools, so LLMs, ChatGPT or other LLMs cannot assume authorship or responsibility for papers or research. That's very clear. I think a little bit what you were saying, Bernardo, that there is a kind of hype moment to begin with. I think we have overcome that particular hurdle. I think it's all very clear that it may be a tool for writing also that clearly has to be disclosed as other tools as well. I think there is an interesting, so coming back to the equity issue, we know that we ourselves, unfortunately, continue to be biased, and the human biases are seen perpetuated in many of the AI systems. We have to guard against this. Mm-hmm. We have to continuously go back to check to what extent we try to eliminate or compensate for any biases that might have crept in. But there are some interesting examples of technologies which are no longer new, but at some point were, and they were actually, rather than creating the us and them divide, they bridged the divides. And the obvious example is mobile telephony.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a fantastic example where whole continents were suddenly brought into a conversation and connectivity because it allowed this sort of leapfrogging. So can we look to AI to achieve,
democratize,
help us achieve something similar?
Yeah.
I think that would be a fantastic opportunity for us. You see, my optimism is coming through again.
The glass level is rising. Yes,
exactly.
That's great. That's excellent. Is there going to be a nature AI?
Well, we do have nature computer science, computational science, so of course that's sort of more encompassing. We also have nature machine intelligence, which again, of course, AI itself is actually a very old discipline.
Yes.
Several decades old. The reason why we're all talking about it now is, of course, because the LLMs have sort of burst onto the pages of newspapers and so on. Yeah. But the discipline is much more mature, and there is, of course, much more to AI than just generative approaches.
And you,
well,
Alejandro?
So I'm a card-carrying mathematician. Uh-huh. So I see. I'm very excited about AI, in particular the context that Marguerite mentioned in science, in the natural sciences, in material design. There's some fantastic work being done. You know, in Canada, we just gave out the biggest grant ever to do a self-driving lab, creating new molecules, to really using the full power of AI with materials design. And I find that there will be huge progress, and it's almost the new way of doing science. People have to learn how get into that. It's like calculators, you know, before calculators and after calculators. And I should say, as a mathematician, in some courses that we teach, we tell people you cannot use a calculator in the exam, and they have to do it with a pencil. It's the last time they do these calculations by hand. So somehow the genie is out of the bottle, and it's going to be very difficult to put it back in, to regulate, and to monitor that. I don't have any good answers to that. I think, in some sense, we're going to, I'm an optimist, so I see there'll be great things coming out of it, but there'll also be some terrible things coming out of it. And if you don't like war, for example, the applications to all sorts of things about weapons and so forth is really terrifying. So this would depend on the self-restraint of humanity. So it's a yin and a yang. So it's a different, exciting era, but it has a lot of risks, and I don't have any good answers to how you can mitigate them.
That's great. I think that's a very real answer as well. I think that nobody yet knows how to kind of navigate that social, legal, ethical governance, integrity, data integrity, inclusivity, and all of that. And I think this is where I think back to global scientific cooperation and collaboration, you know, the community needs to come together to sort through all of these. So let me now turn to the audience, see if there are any questions. Okay, we have a question over here, and then there.
Hi, my name is Peter Ataja. Hi, my name is Peter Ataja. I'm from Lancet, another mission-driven science enterprise to solve disease of poverty. Yep. So my question actually is to Magdalena. Going back to Bernard's mother and my grandmother, where we came from, I think one of the roles of science has been to preserve knowledge. And yet what's happening right now is that, I mean, my kids were born here. And so the next generation is losing the knowledge that actually sustained and preserved these communities for years. what innovations are you, and I don't know if it's the role of the journals, but what innovations are we bringing to bear to help identify, curate, and preserve the less formalized knowledge, which really could, be a big part of the next, innovation, wave of innovation. We're losing them. The move from the villages into the urban centers in our countries is also helping lose that connection to the indigenous knowledge. So is there a platform? When I was doing my doctorate, I had to go to decades of nature, and you preserve those knowledge.
Goodness, thank you for starting with a nice and simple question to which I can provide a very succinct answer. Not, obviously. It's a hugely important issue that you raise, and there are so many things I could say to this. First of all, of course, the role of, you started out by saying the role of science is to preserve knowledge. It's, of course, to build and extend on it. But then the crucial aspect would be for science to start with inclusive sort of view of knowledge, which is exactly at the heart of your question. I think where to start? So you mentioned specifically, well, let me take a step back. So the issue of the loss of indigenous or local traditional knowledge is, of course, a really complex issue. It's an issue of globalization. It's an issue of behavioral and social science. So incidentally, when we talk about science, we must remember that we're not just talking about natural sciences or applied sciences. We're also talking about social and behavioral sciences, which are absolutely key to the issue that you raise. I think we're all actually waking up to the fact, I will be honest, in some cases probably too late, because some knowledge has been lost, but we're all waking up to the fact that it is absolutely crucial to capture and merge, if you like, bring together the knowledge that has emerged from the traditional sort of global north scientific approaches with knowledge that has been gotten in other traditional ways. The crucial question to me is, how do we do this in a meaningful way? Because this knowledge has been arrived at, by definition, in different ways. So how do we make it compatible? And that is a focus of active research. I don't know if you know, NSF, for example, has just started up a new institute funded specifically to address that question. How do we bring on common ground the so-called traditional scientific knowledge with indigenous knowledge? So moves like this, and there are of course many others, are a demonstration of a recognition that it's absolutely important not to borrow and exploit one information and knowledge system for the sake of another, but really bring them together on the same platform at some equal level. Another example that I will give you is actually how indigenous people, trained as researchers or not, are increasingly engaging themselves in the issues that perhaps previously have been the domain of traditional science. So one example that springs to mind immediately, earlier on in the summer, there was, on the Indigenous Peoples Day, there was a summit, a 24-hour ongoing summit organized by Indigenous youth who were specifically arguing about the need for inclusion of them as stakeholders in the efforts to resolve the climate crisis. We actually published a comment from them in the pages of Nature, but independently of that, there was a 24-hour participatory online summit. And this is a fantastic illustration of how those individuals, and youth in particular, right, they are the future by definition, who have that knowledge and awareness of the local knowledge and requirements, wishing to participate in knowledge preservation, but also creation going forward.
Well, thank you. That was a hugely important question, and I think we are barely scratching the surface of how we're going to handle this. And we are unfortunately out of time, but I think that those of us who are here in person, I want to say bye to all of our friends on LinkedIn, but those of us who are here in the room, maybe we can take, I saw one more hand up, and I want to make sure that you have the chance to ask a question. And if not, we can just mingle. There's a few minutes to wrap up as well.
Yes, it was actually related to that question.
Okay. It was related to that question. Okay.
Hello, my name is Tammy Padina. I'm a science consultant. The question is actually related to indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, as well as citizen science. I was wondering what kind of initiatives is the UN putting forth to integrate citizen science and that traditional knowledge going forward? Thank you.
Great. Do we want to take the citizen science piece? Yeah, why don't we go in the reverse order?
I can only talk about Canada. I can talk about the UN. So we have in Canada, as part of our process of reconciliation with the Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit communities, we started a process of engaging with the communities and finding mechanisms for the co-creation of research and the incorporation of knowledge and its validation as co-equal. So there was a very detailed process, and because there are many communities which are involved, right? And they've established a sort of a roadmap with some overarching committees composed of elders, members of the community, that will guide the funding agencies directly, embedded in the funding agencies, and give us advice as to how we should be doing this. At the same time, within our programs, we've opened up to indigenous communities, the eligibility for many of the programs, capacity building for indigenous youth, special scholarships. So it's kind of a multi-pronged attempt. Mistakes are made, you get up, keep on working, consulting all the time. So but there is a sustained effort to move, because it's a fundamental promise of reconciliation. The research agenda is there. So that's a key thing. Now, in the citizen researcher or engaging, we call popularization of science, we do have some funding, we call it promo science, where citizens, schools, organizations can apply for funding to create mechanisms for the promotion of science at a grassroots level and getting the youth interested, people across the country. And obviously in things like biodiversity, it is going to be the citizens. We need those as observers, right? Because we can't, a country like Canada, which is so big, you're going to have to need all these people. So there are many efforts, of course, woefully inadequate because it's a very big thing. And I think it should be a much more important priority.
Bernardo.
From the United Nations perspective, the UNESCO is the agency that really leads in that front. There's a program called Local Indigenous Knowledge System Program, LINKS, that really, is at the center of bringing that and promote that local and indigenous knowledge to promote, to contribute to science and as well as policy processes. So, but that's, is it enough? No, it's not.
Yeah.
So we need all of us to keep that in mind to make sure that we can have a meaningful result and impact to bringing those local and indigenous knowledges into modern science, into policy processes and others, to make sure that one impacts positively the others. So I think that's key. But yes, there is, from the United Nations perspective, UNESCO is the agency that is really focusing on that. And but we need to
do more.
To do more.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You want to quick comment on citizen science?
My only comment to very appropriate responses would actually be that I would suggest that we stop using the term citizen science because it has acquired, you know, a slightly somehow less important meaning. Oh, you know, these people will just collect some data, maybe something about butterflies or maybe something about stars, and then we'll use that data. We won't acknowledge them, by the way, and then, you know, we as in researchers will move forward. I think you used the word, which I think is the kind of the version of today, which is co-creation. Mm-hmm. So involving all the different stakeholders in the science, that's a much more appropriate, if you like, a grown-up way of thinking about it, which also dovetails back with this issue of trust in science, understanding of how science works. So I may be wrong about the sort of feeling about the word citizen science.
Yeah.
Exactly, it's sort of somehow somebody else who said segregated,
sense, yeah.
exactly. So that would be my comment. Why not talk about the truly inclusive, co-creative science instead?
It's great. Co-creation, inclusion, collaboration, cooperation. I mean, that's what it's all about. And, you know, I feel like we barely scratched the surface of this very important topic, but I'm glad that we're going to continue the conversation over the course of this week and next week. So before we end, I just want to make sure that everybody heard the applications are now open. And so with respect to AI, we do want to call on entrepreneurs and innovators to apply for you know, the seed money and 1-year residency at CURE. And in the application process, we're asking people to come with ideas, but to also note the consideration for how they would do it responsibly and what kind of governance, ethical, legal, social implications they would put in place to make their idea come alive. So thank you all. So thank you so much, Alejandro, Magdalena, Bernardo. Really appreciate it. And Declan, thank you for bringing us all together. Really appreciate it. Thank you.